15 B-29s were modified for one mission, and most of the crews never knew why. On the 17th of August 1944 at Wendover Army Airfield, Utah, Colonel Paul W. Tibbets Jr. took charge of the 509th Composite Group's first Silverplate work, while crews around him saw B-29-1s losing the parts that made a standard Boeing B-29 Superfortress dangerous to its own men. The upper and lower gun turrets came off. The tail guns were reduced. Armor was stripped. The aircraft stood lighter, cleaner, and wrong by design. One documented account says the secrecy was so tight that guard posts and flight line access were controlled by special security rules, and ordinary maintenance crews were kept out. That was the point. What Tibbets and his men did not know was how narrow the mission would be, or why every kilogram mattered. Within the project, 15 modified B-29s were being prepared for one weapon drop, and the first trained crews were already being shaped for a single morning over Japan. These bombers were built for one weapon, and no one on the ramp was being told the whole reason. In 1944, the United States Army Air Forces selected the Boeing B-29 Superfortress for a special modification program called Silverplate. The standard B-29 was a 4-engine bomber with remote gun systems, pressurized compartments, and a maximum bomb load built for conventional ordnance. Silverplate changed that logic. At Wendover Army Airfield, Utah, the 509th Composite Group trained under Colonel Paul W. Tibbets Jr., with security so tight that the work sat behind guarded gates and restricted access. The program used 1-5 aircraft, not a whole bomber force. The first modifications were done under Manhattan Project direction, with contractor work tied to Martin and other companies. The mission requirement was specific. The bomb bay had to be altered for a long cylindrical weapon. Weight had to come out of the airframe. Gun turrets and much of the armor were removed. Fuel and engine systems were adapted for long-range delivery. The aircraft still kept the B-29's 4 Wright R-3350 engines, each rated at 2,200 horsepower, but the rest of the machine was being changed around a single payload. Tibbets was chosen to lead the group because the mission needed a commander who could fly a heavy bomber, organize a special unit, and keep its purpose concealed. The question was no longer what the B-29 could carry in theory. It was what this small, altered group was being built to carry in practice. The work began to move in 1944, when Silverplate aircraft were assigned to the secret effort while the wider war still treated the B-29 as a conventional strategic bomber. Boeing's production line built the baseline airframe, but Silverplate machines were pulled into a different standard. Extra armor came out. The bomb bay doors were altered. The gun system changes reduced drag and saved weight. Those changes mattered because the B-29's range and payload had to be preserved for a very long flight from the Central Pacific to Japan. The aircraft selected for the program were not all identical, but the documented direction was consistent. Make the bomber lighter, make the bomb bay fit a weapon that was not standard size, and keep the rest of the aircraft stable enough to deliver it. At Wendover, the 509th Composite Group trained away from normal bomber traffic, which was a security measure in itself. That isolation kept the unit separate from ordinary crews and from ordinary questions. It also meant many men handled the aircraft without being briefed on the full reason for the alterations. Colonel Paul W. Tibbets Jr. later became the public face of the mission, but at this stage he was still managing a special force built around concealment, not announcement. The secrecy extended beyond the flight line. Only a limited circle knew the full purpose of the Silverplate conversions, and the rest saw only stripped turrets, modified bomb bays, and careful guard procedures. The documented result was 15 B-29s prepared for a single weapon delivery. That is why the thesis line fits the record exactly. These bombers were built for one weapon. By the time the first crews moved from training into deployment, the program was already at the edge of the mission that began at Wendover and continued into the Pacific. On the 17th of August 1944, Colonel Paul W. Tibbets Jr. took command at Wendover Army Airfield, Utah, and the Silverplate work moved from planning into actual modification. 15 B-29s were assigned to the program. They were not treated like standard Boeing B-29 Superfortresses. At the Martin plant and other contractor facilities, the airframes were being prepared for one long cylindrical bomb, not for the normal load of conventional ordnance. The bomb bays had to be enlarged and reshaped. The upper and lower gun turrets were removed. The tail armament was reduced. Armor was stripped from the aircraft. The purpose was simple: reduce weight and create the space and release conditions required for the special weapon. Tibbets later became the visible commander of the 509th Composite Group, but at Wendover the men around him saw only a bomber that had been altered in ways that made it lighter and less familiar. The secrecy was strict, guard rules controlled access to the flight line, and ordinary maintenance crews were kept out of the full work. That meant many men handled the airplanes without knowing why the changes mattered. By late 1944, the first crews were training in isolation for a mission they were not fully told about. The aircraft still carried the 4 Wright R3350 engines that powered the B-29, but the rest of the machine had been changed to make one delivery possible. The recorded result was a force of 15 modified bombers built for a single weapon, under a security system that kept the reason hidden from most of the men doing the work. Silverplate worked because the B-29 could be reshaped around a payload the standard bomber was never designed to carry. The normal B-29 had remote-controlled gun turrets, armor, and a bomb bay arrangement meant for conventional loads. The Silverplate conversion removed or reduced those features to save weight and to make room for the weapon. That mattered because the bomb used against Japan was a long, heavy cylinder, and the aircraft had to carry it over a long Pacific route. The program also demanded changes to the bomb release system and to fuel handling so the aircraft could complete the mission at range. The B-29's Wright R3350 engines were each rated at 2,200 horsepower, but engine power alone was not enough. Range, stability, and bomb bay fit all had to be preserved at the same time. The strategic reasoning came from the Manhattan Project and the Army Air Forces. The aircraft had to be adapted so the weapon could be delivered on schedule from the 509th Composite Group. Colonel Paul W. Tibbets Jr. was selected because he could organize a special unit and fly the mission profile. What the Japanese side believed was far more limited. Before Hiroshima, their intelligence and military observers did not know the nature of the weapon. They saw only an attack aircraft and then an explosion unlike any conventional raid. The gap between those two realities defined the secrecy of Silverplate. The first consequence was operational. The 509th Composite Group moved from training at Wendover toward deployment with aircraft that had been tuned for a single task. The crews were few, the machines were few, and the work circle stayed narrow. That gave the mission a level of control that ordinary bomber units never had. It also meant the bombers were being held to a standard that mixed combat flying with laboratory precision. On the Japanese side, the first attack at Hiroshima produced confusion in official channels. Reports reaching military and government authorities did not immediately identify what had been used. The weapon's nature was still unclear when the destruction had already been done. That uncertainty was itself a reaction to the Silverplate system, because the aircraft had delivered a bomb whose design and method of use had been concealed until the moment of impact. In the hours that followed, the mission's meaning changed for both sides. For the Americans, the modified B-29 force had proved it could carry the new weapon to target. For Japanese observers, the attack forced a reassessment of air defense and civil defense at the same time. The small number of modified aircraft, the guarded maintenance system, and the special training at Wendover now pointed to one reality. The United States had built a bomber force around a weapon that had not yet been named in public. From there, the next question was no longer about whether the aircraft could carry it, but how the rest of the secret system had been made to work. Silverplate also changed the B-29 in ways that were easy to miss unless you worked on the aircraft every day. The bomb bay doors were modified for faster opening and closing. because the weapon had to clear the aircraft cleanly in a short release window. British-type bomb release gear was installed so the special weapon could be carried and dropped with the needed precision. That detail mattered because standard American ordnance gear was not the system chosen for the mission. The airframes were also strengthened, especially in the areas needed to carry the unusual load and absorb the stresses of the long Pacific flight. The program was tiny. Only 15 aircraft were assigned to Silverplate, and they were kept within a tightly controlled maintenance and pilot circle. At Wendover, the 509th Composite Group worked apart from normal bomber traffic, and that separation was part of the security system. Guarded hangars, restricted flight line access, and careful handling rules meant that many mechanics saw only pieces of the project, not the whole purpose. In the field, the aircraft looked wrong in another way too. The empty gun positions left by the removed turrets were visible to anyone near the ramp. Crews knew the machines had been lightened, but many did not know that the design was being shaped around one payload. Training also made the aircraft behave differently. The crews had to learn long-range, high-speed bombing runs, steep escape turns, and timing that left little room for error. Silverplate aircraft were not just stripped, they were made to handle differently, with performance and release procedures tailored to a single mission profile. Even the route from training to deployment was controlled so the force stayed isolated from ordinary units. The result was a bomber fleet that looked like a standard B-29 only from a distance. Up close, it was a special machine built around a hidden requirement, and the secrecy reached far enough that many of the men working near it still did not know what it was for. How far did that secrecy go, and who inside the program still did not know the full reason? That secrecy mattered because Silverplate was not an isolated modification job. It was one part of the atomic bomb delivery system built by the Manhattan Project, the Army Air Forces, and the 509th Composite Group. The aircraft had to fit the bomb had to survive the flight, and the flight had to reach Japan on schedule. Official histories of the Manhattan Project and post-war studies of the 509th make the same point from different angles. The weapon was never just a laboratory object. It was a system, and the bomber was one of its most fragile links. That is why the Silverplate conversion received such attention. American industry had already solved the deeper problems behind the scenes, from bomb design to testing to production planning, before the aircraft ever rolled toward the runway. The other side noticed the result, not the preparation. Japanese reports after Hiroshima showed confusion about what had been used, and that confusion reflected the gap between the secrecy on the American side and the intelligence picture in Japan. What reached Japanese officials first was not a clear technical explanation but the scale of destruction and the failure of ordinary air defense assumptions. The attack forced a reappraisal of bomber threat, civil defense, and the entire idea of a single aircraft carrying a city-destroying weapon. That is the larger meaning of Silverplate. It showed that the United States could connect research, manufacturing, training, and combat delivery into one chain. It also showed that secrecy could hold long enough to keep even many participants working without the full picture. These bombers were built for one weapon, and the wartime impact came from that exact purpose. The mission worked because every hidden change on the airframe matched a decision already made in laboratories, factories, and planning rooms. The question then moves from the machine to the men who flew it and the people who faced it. Colonel Paul W. Tibbets Jr., commander of the 509th Composite Group, was the man put in charge of the special force at Wendover. He had the job of organizing the unit, keeping it disciplined, and protecting the secrecy around the aircraft. He later flew the Enola Gay on the Hiroshima mission. After the war he remained closely identified with the operation and was one of the principal American voices explaining it. His role made him the public face of Silverplate, but during the build-up he was also the officer managing the narrow circle of pilots and ground crews who handled the modified bombers. Captain Robert A. Lewis was the aircraft commander on the Hiroshima strike and served as co-pilot under Tibbets for the mission. Major Theodore Van Kirk was the navigator. Both men were part of the carefully briefed crew that flew from Tinian on the 6th of August 1945. The documented record shows that these men were working inside an operation whose full meaning had been withheld until late in the process. Their flight ended the long secrecy in action, but not in understanding. The mission was still only partly grasped by many of the men involved until after the bomb had been used. On the Japanese side, the fear became official almost immediately. Hiroshima's leaders, civil authorities, and military channels were forced to deal with destruction on a scale that did not fit existing categories. Post-war Japanese testimony and investigations repeatedly returned to the same shock. The weapon was unlike the bombs they had been prepared to face. Some reports could not identify the device at once, and the delay itself became part of the terror. For the men inside Silverplate, the secrecy had hidden the purpose. For Japanese officials, the first evidence was the city itself. When the meaning of the weapon finally became clear, it changed the war, the mission, and the legacy of the aircraft that had carried it into history. By late July 1945, the Silverplate force had been committed to combat from Tinian, and the first use came on the 6th of August when the Enola Gay dropped the uranium bomb over Hiroshima. The mission did not end with the bomb run. It began a chain of decisions in Tokyo and Washington that moved faster than the aircraft itself. Japanese leaders spent the next days trying to understand whether the destruction came from one aircraft, one weapon, or a new class of attack. On the 8th of August, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and Soviet forces entered Manchuria. On the 9th of August, Boxcar flew from Tinian and dropped the plutonium bomb over Nagasaki. The sequence of Hiroshima, Soviet entry, and Nagasaki drove Japan's Supreme Council into its final crisis. Emperor Hirohito's recorded intervention on the 14th of August broke the deadlock, and Japan announced acceptance of surrender terms on the 15th of August 1945. The consequences also reached the airmen who had built the delivery system. On Tinian, the crews of the 509th Composite Group had to account for a mission that had been kept narrow enough that many of the men who handled the aircraft still did not know the full purpose until very late. In the weeks after the war, the Silverplate bombers were no longer secret field machines. They became the proof that a bomber could be tuned around a single special weapon and then used in combat. The men who maintained them had worked under guard restrictions, stripped turrets, and altered bomb bay hardware without being told the full story. Afterward, those same details became part of the explanation for how the mission succeeded. The Japanese shock was immediate and lasting. Hiroshima's destruction forced officials, doctors, and military officers to confront injuries and damage unlike those produced by conventional air raids. The attack was not read at first as a routine bombing. It was read as an event without an established category. That uncertainty was part of the weapon's effect. By the time the second Silverplate bomb fell on Nagasaki, the Japanese government had already been pushed into a decision it could no longer delay. The narrow secret at Wendover had become a public end to the Pacific War. What the Americans had hidden in Utah had now changed the timetable of surrender in Tokyo. Silverplate is treated as a turning point because it joined three things that had not previously been joined in one operational chain: a heavily modified long-range bomber, a secret weapon, and a combat unit trained to deliver it on the first try. Standard histories of the Manhattan Project and the 509th Composite Group treat that combination as decisive. The bomber was not just a carrier, it was part of the weapon system. Without the stripped weight, altered bomb bay, and specialized release procedures, the bomb could not have been delivered the way planners required. The before and after contrast is clear. Before August 1945, Japan faced a conventional air war in which bomber streams, firebombing, and air defense warnings defined expectation. After Hiroshima, one aircraft had demonstrated that a single mission could produce city-scale destruction. That is why the mission mattered beyond the two target cities. It proved that the atomic bomb was not only a laboratory achievement or a test result at Trinity. It was an operational weapon that could be put on a bomber and taken to war. The Japanese reaction itself became part of the historical record. Interrogations and post-war accounts from Japanese officers repeatedly showed that the first attack was not understood in technical terms at once. The scale of the destruction was obvious. The mechanism was not. That gap is one reason the mission is remembered as a turning point. The weapon arrived before the full explanation did. American participants also left a hard-edged record of why the secrecy had to hold. Paul W. Tibbets Jr. later explained in interviews and memoir material that the mission depended on surprise and on a successful first delivery, because there would not be a second chance if the aircraft, the bomb, or the target approach failed. That documented logic sits behind the entire Silverplate program. The aircraft were altered for one weapon, the crews were held in a closed circle, and the operation was protected until the moment of use. The strategic lesson was immediate, but the human record is just as clear. A few dozen men were asked to carry a secret whose meaning only fully emerged after the bomb had already fallen. From there, the story moves from strategy to memory, and from memory to the people who carried it afterward. Paul W. Tibbets Jr. remained the best-known American figure from the mission. He later served in the United States Air Force, retired as a brigadier general in 1966, and died in 2007. Robert A. Lewis survived the war, left the service, and died in 1987. Theodore Van Kirk also survived, later worked in civilian life, and died in 2014. Their post-war lives kept the mission in public view through interviews, lectures, and debate. The aircraft themselves also entered memory in a concrete way. Enola Gay was restored and placed on display at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. Boxcar is preserved at the National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. Those preserved bombers do not stand as abstract symbols. They are the same type of machine that had been stripped, guarded, and altered for Silverplate work. The mission's remembrance has also taken the form of annual observance. On the 6th of August, Hiroshima holds a peace memorial ceremony at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park. On the 9th of August, Nagasaki holds its own remembrance. Those dates keep the two Silverplate missions tied to the same calendar of destruction and surrender. The atomic bombing remains central to American and Japanese memory because it marks the point where the Pacific War ended and the nuclear age began. The opening image of a polished B-29 with stripped turrets and guarded mechanics now has its answer. It looked wrong because it had been built wrong on purpose. The aircraft were not being prepared for a normal bombing campaign. They were being shaped for a single weapon that would be carried to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The secret was so tight because only one chance existed to deliver it successfully. These bombers were built for one weapon. If stories like this matter to you, the next one goes even deeper.